September the 20th, 1187. The walls of Jerusalem stood defiant against the morning sun, their weathered stones bearing witness to 88 years of Christian rule. Behind those walls, Balian of Ibelin watched the horizon with growing dread, knowing what was coming. The army that had defended this holy city lay scattered across the hills of Hattin, destroyed less than 3 months earlier. The knights who had sworn to protect Jerusalem were dead or captured. The king himself sat in chains in a Damascus prison, and now, as dust rose in the east, the army of Saladin approached to claim what the First Crusade had taken in blood and fire nearly a century before. This is the story of how one siege changed the balance of power in the medieval world, how a Kurdish sultan transformed himself from a reluctant soldier into the man who would reclaim Islam's third holiest site, and how the fall of Jerusalem would send shockwaves through Christian Europe that would be felt for generations. But to understand how Jerusalem fell in October 1187, we must first understand the man who took it, and the catastrophic battle that made his victory inevitable. Saladin Yusuf ibn Ayyub was born in 1137 or 1138 in the fortress town of Tikrit in present-day Iraq. His family was Kurdish, members of a proud warrior culture that had served the Muslim world for generations. His father, Ayyub, and his uncle Shirkuh were elite military commanders serving under Imad al-Din Zangi, the powerful Turkish ruler who governed northern Syria. From childhood, young Yusuf, as he was known, grew up in the shadow of war and politics. The boy who would become Saladin learned to ride before he could write, mastered the bow before he understood poetry, and studied the art of war as other children studied scripture. But Saladin's education was not purely martial. His family ensured he received training befitting a potential leader. He studied Islamic jurisprudence, theology, and Arabic literature. He learned classical texts and mathematics. Most importantly, he absorbed the principles of Sunni Islam that would guide his entire life. Unlike many military leaders of his era, Saladin never drank wine, lived austerely, and distributed wealth to the poor rather than hoarding it for himself. When his wife once complained about lacking money for clothes, he responded that he was merely a custodian of Muslim wealth and would not deceive the faithful by spending it on personal luxuries. At 14, Saladin joined his uncle Shirkuh's staff, beginning a military apprenticeship that would shape his destiny. Shirkuh served Nur al-Din, the son and successor of Zangi, who ruled from Damascus. Through his father's connections, young Saladin had known Nur al-Din since childhood. This relationship would prove crucial. In 1163, at age 26, Saladin accompanied Shirkuh on a military expedition to Egypt. The dying Fatimid Caliphate that ruled Egypt had become a prize fought over by Nur al-Din from Syria and King Amalric of Jerusalem. A complex three-way struggle developed, with each side attempting to control Egypt and its vast wealth. The Egyptian campaigns tested Saladin in ways his training never had. He fought in the scorching deserts, navigated treacherous political alliances, and learned that victory often came through diplomacy as much as through the sword. In 1169, when Shirkuh suddenly died after achieving control of Egypt, 31-year-old Saladin found himself thrust into command. He was appointed both commander of Syrian troops in Egypt and vizier to the Fatimid Caliph. His rise seemed improbable. He was young, relatively inexperienced in independent command, and an outsider to Egyptian politics. Yet he possessed talents his enemies had not anticipated: political cunning, strategic patience, and an ability to inspire loyalty. 2 years later, in 1171, Saladin abolished the Fatimid Caliphate entirely, ending the Shiite dynasty that had ruled Egypt for 2 centuries. He declared allegiance to the Sunni Abbasid Caliphate based in Baghdad, effectively uniting Egypt with the broader Muslim world under Sunni leadership. He was now Sultan of Egypt, governing in Nur al-Din's name. But the relationship between master and protege grew tense. Nur al-Din, observing Saladin's growing power, began to suspect his ambitious subordinate of disloyalty. By early 1174, Nur al-Din was mustering armies, preparing what appeared to be an invasion of Egypt to bring his wayward vassal to heel. Then fate intervened. On May 15, 1174, Nur al-Din died suddenly after falling ill following a game of polo. He was 56 years old at the height of his power. His death left his 11-year-old son as heir to a fractured empire. For Saladin, this moment presented both opportunity and crisis. He could march his armies into Syria and claim Nur al-Din's territories, but doing so risked portraying him as a power-hungry usurper, attacking the lands of his former master. Such an image would destroy his credibility as a leader of jihad against the Crusaders. Instead, Saladin waited, calculating his moves carefully. When Damascus, threatened by rival factions, invited him to take control, he accepted. This gave him the legitimacy he needed. Between 1174 and 1186, Saladin embarked on a methodical campaign to unite the Muslim Near East. He captured Damascus, then systematically brought other Syrian cities under his control. Hama and Homs fell first. Aleppo resisted until 1183. The process was often bloody. Saladin fought fellow Muslims more than he fought Crusaders during these years, a fact that troubled him deeply. But he believed unification was necessary before the Crusaders could be defeated. His conquests were characterized by a mixture of military force and calculated mercy. He released prisoners who swore allegiance. He appointed local leaders to positions of authority when they submitted peacefully. He built mosques and colleges, funded Islamic scholars, and positioned himself as not merely a conqueror but a restorer of Muslim unity and piety. The ideology that drove Saladin was jihad, but not the simplistic warfare the term sometimes suggests. For Saladin, jihad meant the moral struggle to establish justice, protect the faithful, and restore Muslim control over sacred lands. He commissioned scholars to write treatises on jihad. He funded religious institutions throughout his territories. He lived simply, refused luxury, and maintained a reputation for personal piety that impressed even his Christian enemies. This combination of military power and religious authority made him uniquely dangerous to the Crusader states. By 1186, Saladin controlled Egypt, Syria, parts of Mesopotamia, and Yemen. He had achieved what no Muslim leader had accomplished since the First Crusade, the unification of the Muslim territories surrounding the Crusader states. The Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem was now encircled by a unified enemy. The Kingdom of Jerusalem in 1186 was a shadow of its former strength. Founded after the First Crusade captured the city in 1099, the kingdom had never had sufficient manpower to truly secure its position. The Crusader states relied on a thin layer of European knights and soldiers, ruling over a much larger Muslim and Eastern Christian population. Every generation of Crusader leaders worried about the demographic imbalance and the constant need for reinforcements from Europe. But by the 1180s, internal politics had fractured what unity the kingdom possessed. King Guy of Lusignan, who became king in 1186 through his marriage to Queen Sibylla, was viewed by many nobles as weak and indecisive. The powerful Raymond III, Count of Tripoli, refused to acknowledge Guy's authority and maintained an independent stance. The military orders, the Knights Templar and Knights Hospitaller, pursued their own agendas, sometimes contradicting royal policy. Into this fractured political landscape came Raynald of Chatillon, a Crusader lord who controlled the fortress of Kerak. Raynald was everything Saladin was not: impulsive, brutal, and seemingly incapable of strategic thinking beyond immediate gain. In 1185, a truce had been negotiated between Saladin and the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Both sides needed time to consolidate their positions. The truce was supposed to provide stability and allow trade to flourish. In late 1186 or early 1187, Raynald violated the truce in the most provocative way possible. He attacked a Muslim caravan travelling from Damascus to Mecca, one carrying pilgrims on Hajj, the sacred pilgrimage to Islam's holiest city. The caravan was under the protection of the truce. Its passengers included the sister or close relative of Saladin himself, according to some accounts, though this detail remains disputed by historians. What is certain is that the caravan carried Muslim pilgrims travelling under a promise of safe passage. Raynald's raiders killed some of the travellers, enslaved others, and seized their goods. When word reached Saladin of this outrage, he was reportedly on a hunting trip. According to contemporary accounts, he immediately returned to Damascus and swore a sacred oath. He vowed that he would personally execute Raynald of Chatillon for this violation. It was not an idle threat. Saladin understood that Raynald's attack was not merely a violation of the truce, but an insult to Islam itself, an attack on pilgrims travelling to Mecca. Such an offence could not be ignored without diminishing his authority and his claim to lead jihad. Saladin sent messengers to King Guy in Jerusalem, demanding that Raynald be punished and the goods returned. Guy, aware of his own weak position, tried to compel Raynald to comply, but Raynald, secure in his fortress at Kerak and contemptuous of both his king and the Muslims, refused. He reportedly said he was lord of his own lands and would do as he pleased. This refusal gave Saladin the justification he needed. The truce was broken by the Crusaders themselves. Now he could wage war with full religious and political legitimacy. In the spring of 1187, Saladin issued calls throughout his domains. He summoned armies from Egypt, Syria, and beyond. His son, Al-Afdal, led Egyptian forces north. His nephew, Taqi al-Din, brought troops from the east. Emirs and commanders from across the Muslim world answered the call. By early summer, Saladin had assembled perhaps 30,000 men south of Damascus, the largest army he had ever commanded. The Crusaders, recognizing the threat, began their own mobilization. King Guy ordered the largest military levy in the kingdom's history. Every able-bodied knight was summoned. The military orders emptied their fortresses to contribute their elite warriors. Even the True Cross, the most sacred relic in the kingdom, believed to be a fragment of the actual cross on which Jesus was crucified, was brought from Jerusalem to accompany the army and ensure divine favour. The Crusader army that assembled at the Springs of Safaria in late June 1187 was formidable by the kingdom's standards. Contemporary estimates suggest 20,000 men, including approximately 200 to 1,500 heavy cavalry, the armoured knights who were the elite striking force of medieval Christian armies. It was likely the largest field army the Kingdom of Jerusalem had ever assembled. But it was also every fighting man the kingdom possessed. If this army was destroyed, nothing would stand between Saladin and the kingdom's cities. On July 1st, 1187, Saladin made his move. Rather than directly confronting the Crusader army at Safaria, where they had access to water and strong defensive positions, he besieged Tiberias, a fortified city on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee. Tiberias was the capital of the county of Tripoli, held by Raymond III's wife, Countess Ashiva. The city's garrison was small, but its symbolic importance was enormous. Saladin knew that attacking Tiberias would force the Crusaders to respond. The question was how they would respond. Inside the Crusader camp, a heated debate erupted. Raymond III, despite being the lord whose wife was besieged, argued strenuously against marching to Tiberias. His reasoning was sound. Safaria had excellent water supplies. The army was well positioned. Saladin's forces, far from home and laying siege to a city, could not maintain their position indefinitely. Medieval armies, composed largely of feudal levies and volunteers, could rarely sustain campaigns for more than a few months before soldiers demanded to return home. If the Crusaders remained at Safaria, Saladin would eventually be forced to withdraw or attack them on ground of their choosing. But Raymond's council faced fierce opposition. Renaud of Châtillon and Gerard de Riedefort, Grand Master of the Knights Templar, argued that refusing to relieve Tiberias would be cowardice. They accused Raymond of disloyalty, suggesting he was protecting his own interests rather than the kingdom's honour. The debate grew heated and personal. King Guy, caught between factions, agonised over the decision. As night fell on July 2nd, he had decided to follow Raymond's advice and remain at Safaria. But late that night, Gerard de Riedefort visited the king's tent privately. What was said in that conversation remains unknown, but it changed the course of history. By morning, King Guy had reversed his decision. The army would march to Tiberias. At dawn on July 3rd, the Crusader army departed Safaria. They had roughly 16 miles to cover to reach Tiberias, a march that in normal conditions might take a day. But these were not normal conditions. It was the height of summer in Palestine. Temperatures soared above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The route from Safaria to Tiberias crossed dry, rocky terrain with few water sources, and Saladin's scouts watched every move. As soon as the Crusader column left the Springs of Safaria, Saladin's light cavalry attacked. These were not frontal assaults meant to destroy the Christian army. These were harassment tactics, designed to slow the march, inflict casualties, and exhaust the heavily armoured knights. Muslim horse archers, riding fast, manoeuvrable mounts, swooped in from the flanks, loosing volleys of arrows at the Christian troops, then wheeling away before the armoured knights could respond. The Crusader cavalry, weighed down by chainmail and plate armour, riding heavy war horses bred for shock combat rather than speed, could not catch the lighter Muslim cavalry. Throughout the scorching day of July 3rd, the Crusaders struggled forward. The heat was unbearable. Men and horses burdened with armour and weapons gasped for air in the dry heat. There was no water. Every step forward came under constant arrow fire. Casualties mounted, morale plummeted. By afternoon, the army had covered less than half the distance to Tiberias. It became clear they could not reach the city before nightfall. Worse, they could not reach water. The closest water source was still, miles away, at the springs of Hattin. Kingai called a council. Raymond III, who had opposed the march from the beginning, now advised turning toward Hattin, where at least they could water the troops and horses. Other advisers, seeing the army's deteriorating condition, agreed. So the army turned off the main road, heading toward Hattin. This maneuver was exactly what Saladin had anticipated. As the Crusaders changed direction, Muslim forces raced ahead and seized the springs of Hattin before the Christians could reach them. By the time the Crusader vanguard approached Hattin, Saladin's troops controlled the water. As darkness fell on July 3rd, the Christian army made camp on the barren hills near Hattin, overlooked by two peaks known as the Horns of Hattin due to their distinctive shape. They were surrounded by enemy forces. They had no water. Men and horses had been marching and fighting for over 12 hours in intense heat without drinking. The soldiers could hear Muslim drums thundering through the night, psychological warfare designed to prevent sleep and demoralize the enemy. They could see countless campfires surrounding them, advertising the size of Saladin's host. Contemporary chroniclers report that some Crusaders wept in despair that night, knowing what morning would bring. At dawn, on July 4th, 1187, Saladin's forces attacked, but even before the assault began, they added one final torment. Muslim soldiers set fire to the dry brush and scrub covering the hillsides. The wind carried the smoke directly into the Crusader camp. Parched and exhausted men, already desperately thirsty, now choked on acrid smoke that stung their eyes and burned their throats. Out of that smoke came arrows. 400 camel loads of arrows had been brought up during the night, according to Muslim sources. The Muslim archers, resupplied and positioned at optimal ranges, poured volleys into the Crusader ranks. The heavily armoured knights, sitting on increasingly panicked horses, became targets in a massacre. Kingai ordered the army to form battle lines and attempt to break through toward water at Lake Tiberias, just a few miles away. Raymond III, commanding the vanguard, led the first charge. His knights lowered their lances and spurred their horses into a gallop, the classic Crusader cavalry charge that had broken countless Muslim lines in the past. But Saladin had planned for this. The Muslim forces in Raymond's path, commanded by Taqi al-Din, deliberately opened their ranks, allowing Raymond's charge to pass through without resistance. Then they closed behind him, cutting Raymond off from the main army. Raymond, seeing he could not break through, made an agonizing decision. He fled toward Tyre with his surviving knights, abandoning the army and his king. Whether this was cowardice or a rational choice to preserve at least some of the kingdom's military strength remains debated by historians. What is certain is that Raymond died of pleurisy just months later, reportedly consumed by guilt. With Raymond gone, the Crusader army began to disintegrate. The infantry, suffering terribly from thirst and arrows, attempted to break away toward water. Kingai's household knights charged repeatedly, trying to reach Saladin's command position, hoping that killing the Sultan might break the Muslim army. But each charge faltered in the face of disciplined Muslim formations and constant arrow fire. The True Cross, carried into battle by the Bishop of Acre, became a rallying point for the desperate Christians. Soldiers clustered around it, as if proximity to the sacred relic might save them. Instead, it made them a concentrated target. As the battle reached its climax, the bishop was killed and the True Cross was captured. Contemporary Christian accounts describe this loss in apocalyptic terms. The capture of Christianity's most precious relic by Muslim forces seemed to signal divine abandonment. By early afternoon, the Crusader army was shattered. Infantry surrendered in masses. Knights, their horses dead or dying from thirst and wounds, dismounted and formed a final defensive ring on the heights of the Horns of Hattin. King Guy, Reynald of Châtillon, Gerard de Ridefort, and most of the kingdom's nobility were surrounded. They had no water, no hope of relief, and no chance of escape. Kingai ordered the surrender. Saladin's victory was total and catastrophic for the Crusaders. Of the 20,000 men who had marched from Safaria 2 days earlier, perhaps only 200 knights escaped. Thousands of infantry were slaughtered on the field or died from thirst trying to flee. The rest were captured. The entire fighting strength of the Kingdom of Jerusalem was destroyed in a single day. Muslim chroniclers wrote of rivers of Christian blood. Christian sources described it as the greatest disaster since the loss of Edessa in 1144. Saladin treated his noble captives according to the customs of medieval warfare, but with selective brutality that carried political meaning. King Guy and most of the captured nobles were taken to Saladin's tent. The Sultan offered Guy water, a gesture of mercy according to Arab tradition, signalling that the king's life would be spared. But when Guy, after drinking, passed the cup to Reynold of Châtillon, Saladin intervened. Through an interpreter, he informed Reynold that he had not been given water and thus was not under protection. Saladin then personally fulfilled the oath he had sworn months earlier. He executed Reynold with his own sword. Different accounts vary on the exact manner. Some say Saladin struck him once, and his guards finished the job. Others claim Saladin personally beheaded him. What is certain is that Reynold died at Saladin's hand, and his body was displayed as a warning against breaking treaties with the Sultan. The other nobles, including King Guy, were spared and held for ransom. But the Templars and Hospitallers, the military order's knights, received no mercy. Saladin ordered their mass execution. Approximately 230 Templar and Hospitaller knights were beheaded over the following days. Saladin's reasoning was both practical and ideological. These military orders had sworn vows to fight Islam until death. They could not be trusted to honour ransom agreements, and they were too dangerous to release or hold. Only Gerard de Riedefort, the Templar Grand Master, was spared, likely because Saladin calculated his continued incompetent leadership would damage the Crusader cause more than his death would help it. With the Crusader field army destroyed, the Kingdom of Jerusalem lay defenceless. Saladin immediately dispatched his forces to capture the kingdom's cities and fortresses. What followed was a systematic conquest that unfolded with shocking speed. Acre surrendered on July 10th after a siege of only 4 days. Nablus fell the same week. Jaffa, Sidon, Beirut and Ascalon all capitulated in rapid succession throughout July and August. Some cities surrendered without resistance, others negotiated terms. A few, like Tyre, managed to hold out due to fortuitous circumstances. In Tyre's case, the arrival of Conrad of Montferrat, an Italian nobleman with ships and soldiers, provided just enough military strength to resist Saladin's initial assault. Saladin besieged Tyre briefly, but recognizing it would require substantial time and resources to take, he moved on to his ultimate objective, Jerusalem. By mid-September, most of the Kingdom of Jerusalem's territory was in Muslim hands. 52 cities and fortresses had fallen in less than 3 months. Only a handful of strongholds remained. Tyre held out. Some isolated castles with small garrisons still resisted, and Jerusalem itself awaited. On September 20th, 1187, Saladin's army appeared before the walls of Jerusalem. Inside those walls, the situation was desperate. The city was packed with refugees who had fled the Muslim conquest throughout the summer. Estimates suggest 60,000 people crowded into a city designed for perhaps half that number. Women and children vastly outnumbered fighting men. Of knights, the military elite who formed the backbone of medieval Christian warfare, Jerusalem had fewer than 14. The man charged with defending the city was Balian of Ibelin, lord of Ramla and Nablus, and the highest-ranking nobleman to escape Hattin. But Balian's presence in Jerusalem was itself the result of extraordinary circumstances. After Hattin, Balian had fled to Tyre. His wife, Maria Komnena, Queen Dowager of Jerusalem, and their children were in Jerusalem. Balian requested and received safe passage from Saladin to enter Jerusalem, retrieve his family, and escort them to safety. Saladin granted this request on 2 conditions. Balian must stay no more than 1 day, and he must not take up arms against Saladin. Balian swore to these terms and entered Jerusalem. But upon arrival he found the city in chaos. Patriarch Heraclius, Queen Sibylla, and the city's leaders begged him to take command of the defence. They argued he was the only nobleman with military experience, the only one who might organise resistance. Balian protested that he had sworn an oath to Saladin. Heraclius, who was the spiritual leader of the city, offered to absolve him of the oath, claiming that the defence of Jerusalem superseded any promise made to a Muslim. Balian faced an agonising choice. Honour demanded he keep his word. Faith and duty demanded he defend Jerusalem. He chose to stay. Balian sent word to Saladin through a delegation of burgesses, explaining his decision and asking for understanding. Saladin surprisingly accepted this with grace. He He arranged for an armed escort to take Maria, their children, and their household to safety in Tripoli. This act of chivalry was characteristic of Saladin's approach to warfare. He valued honour even in his enemies and respected Balian's decision to defend his city. But Balian knew the task was nearly impossible. The city was full of non-combatants and desperately short of fighting men. His first act was to create new knights. He assembled every squire, every man of good birth who had martial training, and knighted 60 men in a mass ceremony. It was largely symbolic. These newly made knights lacked the years of training and experience that made true knights effective warriors. But the ceremony boosted morale and gave the defence a sense of organisation. Balian then organised the civilian population. He formed improvised units from the burgesses, the townspeople. He assigned sectors of the wall to different groups. He stockpiled food and weapons. Women and children were given roles in the defence. They carried water, food and ammunition to the fighting positions. They helped extinguish fires. Some sources suggest women even manned parts of the walls, though Muslim chroniclers later dismissed such claims as impossible, unable to conceive of women participating in combat. When Saladin's army arrived on September 20th, they found Jerusalem as prepared as possible given its limited resources. Saladin's forces numbered in the tens of thousands, though exact figures are disputed. His army included his elite Mamluks, professional soldiers trained from youth, Kurdish cavalry from his own ethnic group, Egyptian troops, Syrian levies, and volunteers drawn by the promise of holy war and plunder. Saladin initially positioned his forces near the Tower of David and the Damascus Gate on the northern side of the city. His archers began a relentless bombardment of the walls, loosing thousands of arrows to kill defenders and keep them from the ramparts. Siege towers, massive wooden structures designed to bring attackers, level with the tops of walls, were rolled forward, but each assault was repulsed. The defenders, fighting for their lives and their families, fought with desperate courage. They pushed back the siege towers. They sorted out in small raids damaging siege engines. They maintained a stubborn defence that for 6 days held Saladin's army at bay. The civilian defenders' determination impressed even Muslim observers. Contemporary accounts note that the resistance was far stiffer than expected. Muslim commanders reported that phantom reinforcements must have entered the city, unable to believe that women, children and clergy could mount such effective resistance. Imad al-Din, Saladin's secretary, conjured fantastical numbers in his account, claiming 70,000 Frankish troops defended the city, more than double the total Crusader army at Hattin. In reality, Balian's achievement was organisational and inspirational. He had turned a demoralised civilian population into an effective defensive force through sheer force of will and tactical skill. But after 6 days of futile assaults on the northern walls, Saladin recognised that continuing would waste lives and time. On September 26th, he moved his camp to the Mount of Olives on the eastern side of the city. This repositioning was strategic. The eastern walls were older and weaker than the northern fortifications. The ground favoured the deployment of siege engines, and the move kept the defenders off balance, forcing them to redeploy their limited forces. From the Mount of Olives, Saladin's siege engines, catapults and trebuchets, capable of hurling heavy stones with devastating force, began a systematic bombardment. Contemporary accounts describe rocks the size of a man's torso crashing into buildings and walls. The psychological impact was enormous. The constant barrage, the crashes of impact, the clouds of dust and debris all wore down the defenders' morale. More dangerous than the bombardment were the sappers. Medieval siege warfare relied heavily on mining, the practice of digging tunnels under defensive walls, then collapsing the tunnels to bring the walls down. Saladin's engineers began digging under the eastern wall. The defenders could hear the digging, could feel the ground vibrating, but lacked the resources to effectively countermine. On September 29th, the inevitable occurred. A section of the wall near the Damascus Gate was mined and collapsed. A breach opened in Jerusalem's defences. Muslim troops rushed forward to exploit the gap, but the defenders managed to contain the assault temporarily. But Balian understood the situation was now hopeless. With a breach in the walls and insufficient troops to defend it, the city would fall within days, perhaps hours. The only question was whether it would fall by storm or by negotiation. The difference between those two outcomes was literally life and death for Jerusalem's inhabitants. Medieval siege warfare followed brutal customs. If a city surrendered before the walls were breached, the garrison and civilians could expect relatively lenient terms, typically safe passage with possessions in exchange for the city. But if a city forced attackers to storm the walls, to pay in blood for every street, the customs of war permitted the sacking of the city, a license for massacre and plunder. Saladin's emirs and soldiers expected this reward. They had fought for months to reach Jerusalem. They had lost comrades to Christian arrows and swords. Many wanted revenge for the massacre that had followed the First Crusade's capture of Jerusalem in 1099, when Crusaders had slaughtered thousands of Muslims and Jews in the streets. Balian sent word requesting negotiations. Saladin initially refused, stating he had vowed to take Jerusalem by storm as revenge for 1099. He would take the city by force, and its inhabitants would face the sword or slavery. But negotiations continued through intermediaries, particularly through Yusuf Batit, a member of the Eastern Orthodox clergy. The Orthodox Christians, who had been suppressed under Latin rule, saw opportunity in Saladin's victory and acted as mediators. Balian made a desperate threat. He told Saladin's negotiators that if Jerusalem was to be destroyed, the Christians would destroy it themselves rather than hand it over intact. He threatened to kill every Muslim slave in the city, estimated at 5,000 people. He threatened to destroy Islam's holy sites within Jerusalem, particularly the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque. He swore the Christians would set fire to every building, turn Jerusalem into a charred ruin, and then sally out to die fighting. Whether Balian would have actually carried out these threats is unknowable, but Saladin took them seriously. He consulted with his advisors and religious scholars. They pointed out that Jerusalem's Islamic holy sites were under his protection. Destroying them to take the city would undermine his entire claim to be the defender of Islam. Additionally, massacring Jerusalem's inhabitants would create a propaganda disaster. Saladin had positioned himself as a just and merciful ruler, contrasting himself with the brutal Crusaders. Slaughtering civilians would destroy that reputation. After consulting with his council, Saladin agreed to negotiate terms, but he insisted on a compromise between mercy and the rights his army had earned through conquest. He would spare the city and its inhabitants, but every Latin Christian would have to pay ransom to leave. This was the medieval custom for prisoners of war. Without ransom payment, prisoners became slaves. The ransom terms were set: 10 gold dinars for men, 5 dinars for women, and 1 dinar for children. For medieval Palestine, these were relatively modest sums. A skilled craftsman might earn 10 dinars in a few months. But for the thousands of refugees who had fled to Jerusalem with nothing, even these modest ransoms were impossible. Additionally, Saladin agreed to a bulk ransom. The city treasury would pay 30,000 dinars to free 7,000 of the poorest inhabitants who could not afford individual ransoms. This money came from the treasure that King Henry II of England had sent to pay for penance, gold that had arrived too late to save the kingdom, but was now used to save its people. The agreement was proclaimed through Jerusalem's streets on October 2, 1187. 40 days were given for people to raise their ransoms and prepare to leave. What followed was a complex exodus. Those who could afford the ransom paid and were allowed to leave with their possessions, escorted safely to Christian-held territory. Balian himself paid ransoms for thousands, using his own wealth and money raised from various sources. Patriarch Heraclius ransomed himself for 10 dinars, though he was criticised for paying only the minimum when he had access to church treasures that could have freed more people. Queen Sibylla and other noblemen were released without ransom as a courtesy by Saladin. Many Orthodox and Eastern Christians, who had not been part of the Latin hierarchy, were permitted to remain in Jerusalem under Muslim rule. But thousands of the poorest inhabitants, unable to pay and not covered by the bulk ransom, were enslaved. Muslim chroniclers report approximately 15,000 people were taken into slavery, though numbers are disputed. The slave market in Damascus became so flooded that prices collapsed. Some Christian accounts claim Saladin personally freed several thousand slaves using his own money, particularly elderly people and religious figures. Saladin's treatment of Jerusalem stood in stark contrast to the 1099 Crusader conquest. When the First Crusade took Jerusalem, contemporary accounts describe massacres that lasted for days. Muslims and Jews were slaughtered in the streets. The Al-Aqsa Mosque was described as ankle-deep in blood. The Crusaders made no distinction between combatants and civilians. Saladin, by comparison, prevented mass slaughter. The transition of power was relatively bloodless. The key word is relatively. Thousands were still enslaved, families were separated, and people lost everything they owned. But compared to the standards of medieval siege warfare, particularly compared to 1099, Saladin's conquest was remarkably restrained. On Friday, October 2nd, 1187, exactly 88 years after the Crusaders had captured it, Jerusalem returned to Muslim control. Saladin entered the city in triumph. His first act was deeply symbolic. He ordered the great cross that had been placed atop the dome of the rock removed and dragged through the streets. Muslim chroniclers describe this moment as divine justice, the false symbol of Christian dominance literally brought low. The Christian churches were assessed. Saladin, against the advice of some of his more zealous followers, refused to destroy the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, Christianity's holiest site. He recognized its religious significance and decided that permitting Christian pilgrimage to Jerusalem would be both merciful and politically useful. Instead, he ordered that the Islamic holy sites be ritually purified. The Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque were washed with rosewater. The pulpit that Nur al-Din had commissioned years earlier, kept in Aleppo awaiting Jerusalem's liberation, was brought to Al-Aqsa Mosque and installed. On the first Friday after the conquest, October 9th, the call to prayer echoed from the minarets for the first time in 88 years. Saladin prayed at Al-Aqsa surrounded by his emirs and soldiers. The sermon delivered that day proclaimed Jerusalem's return to the House of Islam and praised Saladin as the restorer of Muslim honour. The fall of Jerusalem sent shockwaves through Christian Europe that cannot be overstated. When news reached Rome in late October 1187, Pope Urban III reportedly died of grief, though historians debate whether the news actually caused his death or simply coincided with it. His successor, Gregory VIII, immediately issued a papal bull calling for a new crusade. The document blamed Christian sins for the loss of Jerusalem and called for repentance and military mobilization. Across Europe, the response was unprecedented. 3 kings took the cross, swearing to reconquer Jerusalem. Richard I of England, Philip II of France, and Frederick III Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire all pledged to lead armies to the Holy Land. This would become the Third Crusade, one of the largest military expeditions of the medieval period. But the propaganda war had already shifted in Saladin's favour. His restraint in Jerusalem, his personal piety, and his reputation for keeping his word made him a figure of respect even among Christians. Medieval European writers, even while denouncing him as an enemy of Christendom, could not help but praise his chivalry. The contrast with Reynald of Chatillon's brutality made Saladin appear almost saintly. Stories circulated of his generosity, how he had personally freed elderly Christians who could not pay ransom, how he had reunited families separated during the Exodus, how he had wept upon seeing the suffering of women and children forced to leave their homes. Some stories were true, some were embellished, but together they created an image of Saladin that transcended religious boundaries. Muslim writers went even further in their praise. Imad al-Din, Saladin's personal secretary, wrote panegyrics describing the Sultan as the greatest champion of Islam since the Prophet Muhammad's companions. Poets composed verses celebrating his victories. Religious scholars issued legal opinions declaring his jihad the highest form of Islamic devotion. Saladin became, in his own lifetime, the embodiment of Muslim resistance to the Crusades. The psychological impact of Jerusalem's fall extended beyond immediate military consequences. The Kingdom of Jerusalem had been established on the premise that God favoured the Christian cause. The capture of Jerusalem in 1099 had been interpreted as divine approval of the Crusades. Popes had promised that those who died fighting for Jerusalem would receive immediate entry to heaven. The loss of Jerusalem in 1187 shattered this theological certainty. If God favoured the Christians, how could he permit Islam's holiest sites, as Christians viewed them, to fall back into Muslim hands? This theological crisis prompted intense debate among Christian scholars and contributed to a growing skepticism about the crusading movement. For the remaining Crusader states, Jerusalem's fall marked the beginning of a permanent defensive posture. The Latin kingdom would never fully recover. Even when the Third Crusade later recaptured coastal cities and negotiated Christian access to Jerusalem, the psychological blow could not be undone. The Crusader states existed on borrowed time, dependent on reinforcements from Europe and vulnerable to any unified Muslim offensive. Saladin's conquest also demonstrated the importance of Muslim unity. Every previous attempt to take Jerusalem had failed because Muslim rulers fought each other as much as they fought Christians. The Fatimids had battled the Abbasids, the Seljuks had fragmented into competing dynasties, regional emirs had prioritized their own power over collective resistance. Saladin's achievement was not merely military but political. He had unified Egypt and Syria under a single command, enabling the concentration of force necessary to defeat the Crusaders. But Saladin's victory came at enormous personal cost. The decade-long campaign to unify Muslim territories and defeat the Crusaders had exhausted him physically and financially. Medieval chronicles describe him suffering from various ailments by 1187, likely stress-related conditions exacerbated by years of continuous campaigning. Financially, Saladin had bankrupted himself. Unlike typical medieval rulers who hoarded wealth, Saladin distributed everything to his soldiers, to the poor, and to religious institutions. His personal treasury at his death would contain less than 1 gold dinar and 40 silver pieces, barely enough to pay for his funeral. His generosity inspired loyalty but left his empire vulnerable to succession disputes. The Third Crusade, which arrived in the Holy Land in 1118, would test whether Saladin's conquest could be held. Richard III of England, known as Richard the Lionheart, proved to be the most formidable opponent Saladin ever faced. The two leaders fought to a stalemate over 3 years of brutal campaigning. Richard recaptured Acre and much of the coast but could not retake Jerusalem. The negotiations between Richard and Saladin revealed mutual respect. At one point, Richard, whose horse had been killed in battle, was sent 2 replacement horses by Saladin, who reportedly said it was not fitting for such a great warrior to fight on foot. Richard, for his part, referred to Saladin as a worthy adversary, high praise from the proud English king. The Treaty of Jaffa in September 1192 ended the Third Crusade. It represented a compromise that satisfied neither side fully but recognised reality. The Crusaders retained control of the coastal cities from Tyre to Jaffa, ensuring maritime access and trade. Saladin retained Jerusalem and the interior. Critically, Christian pilgrims were guaranteed safe passage to visit Jerusalem's holy sites. This arrangement acknowledged that Jerusalem held religious significance for both faiths and that coexistence, however uneasy, was preferable to endless war. Within months of signing the treaty, Saladin fell ill. On March 4, 1193, he died in Damascus at age 55 or 56. The cause was likely a fever, possibly typhoid. Contemporary accounts describe him receiving last rites from Islamic scholars and distributing his remaining possessions to the poor. At his funeral, a crier walked before his coffin carrying Saladin's shroud on a lance, calling out that the great Sultan, conqueror of the East, could take nothing with him but this cloth. Saladin's death immediately triggered the succession crisis his poverty had made inevitable. His empire was divided among his sons and brothers, fragmenting the unity he had worked so hard to create. Within a generation, the Ayyubid dynasty he founded would decline, eventually replaced by the Mamluks. But his conquest of Jerusalem remained. Despite numerous subsequent crusades, Jerusalem would remain under Muslim control, with brief exceptions, until the 20th century. The Kingdom of Jerusalem limped along for another century, progressively losing territory until Acre, its last major stronghold, fell in 1291. The question that has fascinated historians for centuries is why Saladin succeeded where so many before him had failed. Part of the answer lies in his personal qualities, his strategic patience, his ability to balance pragmatism with principle, his talent for inspiring loyalty, all contributed to his success. He was genuinely pious in an age when many leaders used religion cynically. He lived simply and distributed wealth rather than hoarding it. These qualities made him an effective leader of jihad because they gave him credibility. But equally important was timing and circumstance. The Crusader states in 1187 were divided by internal conflicts that Saladin exploited brilliantly. Raynal of Chatillon's provocations gave Saladin the casus belli he needed. The Crusader decision to march from Safaria to Tiberias, against sound military advice, handed Saladin a decisive victory at Hattin. And the geopolitical situation, with European powers distracted by their own conflicts, meant reinforcements arrived too late to save Jerusalem. Saladin's treatment of Jerusalem also reflected calculated political strategy. By showing restraint, he undermined Crusader propaganda that had long portrayed Muslims as barbaric enemies of civilization. he demonstrated that Muslim rule could be more merciful than Christian rule. This was sophisticated information warfare that served his long-term goals even as some of his followers criticized him for excessive mercy. The ransoming system, while harsh, was considered legitimate by medieval standards and more humane than the alternatives. The permission for Christian pilgrimage created an economic benefit, as pilgrims brought wealth to Jerusalem, while also demonstrating Muslim magnanimity. Saladin understood that holding Jerusalem required not just military power, but also legitimacy in the eyes of both Muslim and Christian worlds. The comparison between 1099 and 1187 became central to how both civilizations understood the Crusades. Christian chroniclers, even while mourning Jerusalem's loss, could not deny that Saladin's conduct had been more honourable than their ancestors. This created cognitive dissonance in Crusader ideology. How could the Muslim infidel be more Christian in behaviour than Christians themselves? Some writers resolved this by claiming Saladin was secretly Christian or had Christian ancestry, unable to accept that Islamic principles could produce such nobility. Others argued that Saladin was an exception, a uniquely virtuous individual whose behaviour did not reflect Islam generally. But the most thoughtful Christian observers recognized that Saladin's conduct reflected Islamic teachings about warfare, mercy, and the treatment of non-combatants. Islamic sources faced no such crisis. For them, Saladin's victory confirmed that righteousness and divine favour belonged to Islam. The contrast with 1099 proved that Muslims, when united and faithful, could overcome any enemy. Saladin became the model of the ideal Muslim ruler, combining military prowess with piety, justice, and mercy. Subsequent Muslim leaders, from the Mamluks to the Ottomans, invoked Saladin's memory to legitimize their own rule and rally support for campaigns against Christian powers. The siege of Jerusalem in 1187 demonstrated several military lessons that would influence medieval warfare. First, the importance of intelligence and psychological warfare. Saladin's decision to besiege Tiberias rather than directly attacking the Crusader army at Safaria forced his enemies to fight on his terms. His harassment tactics during the march exhausted the Crusaders before the decisive battle. His repositioning from Jerusalem's northern to eastern walls kept defenders off balance and unable to concentrate their limited forces effectively. Second, the siege showed the value of engineering and logistics. Saladin's sappers breached Jerusalem's walls where direct assault had failed. His ability to supply and maintain a large army for months demonstrated organizational sophistication that matched his tactical skill. Medieval warfare was as much about logistics, feeding armies, transporting siege equipment, managing supply lines, as about battlefield heroics. Saladin excelled at both. Third, the siege illustrated the limits of fortifications without adequate garrisons. Jerusalem's walls were formidable, but walls do not defend themselves. With only a handful of knights and a civilian militia, Balian of Ibelin performed miracles holding out for 2 weeks, but ultimately no fortification could stand indefinitely against a determined besieger with superior numbers and engineering capability. This lesson would drive fortress design in subsequent centuries, with increased emphasis on active defence, sally ports, countermining capabilities, and mutually supporting strongpoints. The cultural legacy of Saladin's conquest extended far beyond military history. In Islamic culture, Saladin became the archetypal hero, the man who restored Muslim honour and reclaimed Jerusalem. His name became synonymous with resistance to Western imperialism. In the 20th century, various Arab nationalist movements invoked Saladin as a symbol of unity against colonialism. Saddam Hussein of Iraq, who was also from Tikrit like Saladin, extensively used Saladin's image in his propaganda. Streets, schools, and institutions across the Muslim world bear Saladin's name. In popular culture, he appears as the noble adversary in countless films and novels about the Crusades. In Western culture, Saladin's reputation evolved over centuries. Medieval Europeans viewed him as a worthy enemy, dangerous but honourable. Renaissance writers, rediscovering classical ideals of chivalry, elevated him as an exemplar of knightly virtue. Enlightenment thinkers used Saladin to critique European Christian intolerance, holding up the Muslim Sultan as more enlightened than contemporary Christians. By the 19th and 20th centuries, Saladin had become a figure of romantic fascination, the cultured Eastern potentate who embodied exotic nobility. This romanticization often obscured historical reality. Saladin was indeed comparatively merciful by medieval standards, but he was also a pragmatic ruler who executed prisoners when strategically useful, enslaved thousands, and waged war ruthlessly when necessary. The historical Saladin was more complex and more human than the legend. The siege that changed the Crusades was not merely a military operation, but a turning point in how civilizations understood themselves and each other. For Muslims, it proved that faith and unity could overcome material disadvantages. For Christians, it shattered the certainty that God unambiguously favoured their cause. For both, it demonstrated that war, even holy war, had limits, and that mercy and pragmatism could coexist with military necessity. The question of whether Jerusalem's fall was inevitable remains debated. If the Crusaders had remained at Safaria, if Raymond's counsel had been heeded, if Reynald had not broken the truce, history might have unfolded differently. But such speculation misses the fundamental reality. By 1187, the balance of power had shifted decisively. The Crusader states were demographically unsustainable, politically divided, and militarily overextended. Saladin's unified empire, while not inevitable, represented the natural result of Islamic populations vastly outnumbering Crusader settlers. Jerusalem's fall was not foreordained by divine will, but it was rendered highly probable by strategic realities. The legacy of October 1187 shaped Christian-Muslim relations for centuries. The image of Saladin, the noble Muslim who defeated the Crusaders but spared their lives, challenged simple narratives of civilizational conflict. It suggested that accommodation, respect, and even friendship across religious boundaries were possible. The Treaty of Jaffa, negotiated by Richard and Saladin, established precedents for religious coexistence that would influence later agreements. The concept that holy sites could be shared, that pilgrimage could be permitted even to those of different faiths, these ideas emerged from the practical necessities of 1187 to 1192. They were not born of modern tolerance but of medieval pragmatism, yet they created frameworks for coexistence that transcend their origins. For Balian of Ibelin, the defender of Jerusalem, the siege marked both his greatest achievement and his greatest failure. He had accomplished the impossible, organising an effective defence with almost no resources and holding out long enough to negotiate terms rather than face massacre. His courage and leadership saved thousands of lives, yet he had surrendered Jerusalem, the city he had sworn to defend. He lived the rest of his life in the remaining Crusader territories, serving as a counsellor and diplomat. He participated in negotiations with Saladin during the Third Crusade, his relationship with the Sultan characterised by mutual respect born from their confrontation in 1187. When Balian died in 1193, the same year as Saladin, he was remembered as the last defender of Jerusalem, the knight who chose honour over safety and duty over oath. The physical transformation of Jerusalem under Saladin was significant but less dramatic than might be expected. He did not destroy Christian sites, but rather reconsecrated shared spaces. The Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque were restored to Muslim worship. Churches remained standing, though some were converted to other uses. The Church of St. Anne became a madrasa, an Islamic school. The Hospitallers complex became an endowment to support Muslim institutions, but the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, Christianity's most sacred site, remained a church. Saladin recognised that completely eliminating Christian presence would create a permanent grievance and justify endless crusades. By permitting pilgrimage, he demonstrated that Muslim rule could accommodate Christian devotion, undermining arguments for military reconquest. The demographic changes were more profound. The Latin Christian population, the European settlers who had dominated Jerusalem since 1099, were expelled through the ransom system. Those who could not pay were enslaved and removed. Eastern Christians, members of Orthodox, Coptic, Armenian and other churches who had lived in Palestine for centuries were generally permitted to remain. They had often been marginalised under Latin rule, which considered them heretics, and saw Muslim reconquest as potentially liberating. Jewish communities, which had been largely excluded from Jerusalem by the Crusaders, were invited to return. Saladin encouraged Jewish settlement, recognising that Jews had no interest in supporting future crusades and could contribute to the city's economic life. Within a generation, Jerusalem's population had been transformed from predominantly Latin Christian to predominantly Muslim, with significant Jewish and Eastern Christian minorities, a demographic pattern that would persist for centuries. The economic impact of the siege extended throughout the Mediterranean world. The fall of Jerusalem disrupted trade routes that had developed during Crusader rule. Italian merchant republics, particularly Venice, Genoa, and Pisa, which had established trading posts throughout the Crusader states, suddenly faced hostile territory. Some negotiated new agreements with Saladin, recognizing that commerce could continue under Muslim rule. Others withdrew, refocusing their commercial networks. The slave markets of the Middle East were flooded with Christian captives from Jerusalem and other fallen cities, temporarily depressing prices and creating a glut that took years to absorb. Conversely, the demand for ransoms and the need to finance new crusades created financial innovations in Europe. Banking systems developed to transfer funds across long distances. Credit instruments evolved to support merchants financing crusading expeditions. The Crusades, for all their religious motivation, were also massive economic undertakings that stimulated financial development. The theological implications of Jerusalem's fall occupied Christian thinkers for generations. If the Crusades were God's will, as popes had proclaimed, why did they fail? Various explanations emerged. Some argued that Christian sins, particularly the sins of the Crusaders themselves, had caused God to withdraw his favour. This interpretation emphasised moral reform and repentance as prerequisites for future success. Others argued that God was testing Christian faith, that adversity was meant to strengthen resolve. This view justified continued crusading despite setbacks. A few radical voices questioned whether the Crusades had ever been justified, whether warfare for religious purposes aligned with Christian teachings of peace and forgiveness. These dissenting views remained minority positions, but planted seeds of doubt that would grow over subsequent centuries. Islamic theology faced simpler questions. Saladin's victory confirmed that jihad, when properly conducted by a righteous leader, achieved its purposes. The theological debate centered not on why victory occurred, but on how to maintain it. Scholars discussed whether Saladin's mercy had been excessive, whether he should have been harsher to prevent future Christian reconquest. Others argued his mercy was precisely correct, demonstrating Islam's superiority over Christian brutality. These debates influenced Islamic legal thinking about warfare and the treatment of non-Muslim populations. Saladin's precedents, particularly his protection of non-combatants and permission for religious pilgrimage, became reference points in discussions of Islamic law regarding warfare and religious minorities. The military balance in the Levant after 1187 settled into a pattern that would define the region for a century. Muslim forces controlled the interior and the holy sites. Christian forces controlled coastal cities and maritime trade routes. Neither side could decisively defeat the other. Muslim armies could not effectively besiege coastal cities that could be resupplied by sea. Christian armies could not campaign inland without being cut off from their supply bases. This strategic stalemate led to a system of truces, trade agreements, and occasional skirmishes that more resembled normal interstate relations than the apocalyptic religious warfare of Crusader ideology. Crusader lords learned Arabic, negotiated with Muslim emirs, and sometimes allied with Muslim factions against Christian rivals. Muslim merchants traded with Christian ports. The reality on the ground was far more nuanced than the propaganda suggested. Saladin's personal legacy was complex. He achieved his great goal of reclaiming Jerusalem but died too soon to consolidate his conquest fully. His sons and relatives divided his empire and fought among themselves, undoing the unity he had created. The Ayyubid dynasty he founded would last only until 1250, when the Mamluks seized power in Egypt. Yet his reputation transcended political succession. Future Muslim leaders invoked his name and example. The Mamluks, who defeated the Mongols and finally expelled the last Crusaders from the Holy Land in 1291, claimed to be fulfilling Saladin's vision. The Ottomans, who conquered the entire region in the 16th century, honoured Saladin's memory and maintained his tomb in Damascus as a site of pilgrimage. The siege of Jerusalem in 1187 was not merely one battle or one city changing hands. It was the culmination of decades of political manoeuvring, the result of a catastrophic Christian defeat at Hattin, and the beginning of a new phase in Christian-Muslim relations. It demonstrated that Muslim forces, when unified under effective leadership, could defeat the Crusaders. It showed that restraint and mercy and victory could be as powerful as brutality in shaping long-term outcomes. And it established Saladin as a figure of historical significance, comparable to Richard the Lionheart, his great adversary, as one of the defining personalities of the medieval world. For the people who lived through it, the siege meant displacement, loss, and the end of a world they had known. Latin Christian families who had lived in Jerusalem for 3 or 4 generations were forced to leave, losing homes, properties, and the city they considered their spiritual centre. Eastern Christians faced uncertainty about their status under new Muslim rulers. Jews saw opportunity for return, but also the chaos of military conquest. Muslim residents who had lived under Christian rule welcomed liberation but faced the challenges of a city crowded with refugees and damaged by siege warfare. Behind the grand narratives of kings and sultans were tens of thousands of ordinary people whose lives were upended by forces beyond their control. The siege that changed the Crusades revealed fundamental truths about medieval warfare, religious conflict, and human nature. It showed that even in an age of religious certainty, pragmatism and mercy could triumph over bloodlust. It demonstrated that military victory required not just battlefield prowess, but also political skill, strategic patience, and the ability to inspire loyalty. It proved that empires built on slender demographic foundations and internal division could not survive against unified opposition, no matter how heroic their individual warriors. And it established that Jerusalem, sacred to multiple faiths, would remain a source of conflict but also a potential symbol of coexistence. When Saladin prayed at Al-Aqsa Mosque on that Friday in October 1187, he fulfilled not only a personal vow but also the hopes of Muslims who had dreamed of this moment for nearly 90 years. When Christian pilgrims were permitted to visit the Church of the Holy Sepulchre under Muslim protection, a framework for religious coexistence was established that acknowledged the city's sacred status for multiple traditions. The siege was not the end of conflict over Jerusalem. That conflict would continue for centuries, and in many ways continues today. But the events of September and October 1187 established patterns, precedents, and possibilities that shaped how subsequent generations understood Jerusalem's unique place in human civilization. The city that 3 great religions call holy fell not to massacre and destruction, but to negotiation, and, by medieval standards, relative mercy. That achievement belongs to both Saladin, who showed restraint in victory, and Balian of Ibelin, who defended with honour and negotiated with wisdom. Together, enemies bound by the customs of medieval chivalry, they ensured that Jerusalem's fall, while catastrophic for the Crusader states, did not become a catastrophe for humanity's shared religious heritage. The siege that changed the Crusades did not end the conflict between Christianity and Islam, but it transformed that conflict, demonstrating that even in the crucible of holy war, honour, mercy, and respect could survive.